Hello, and thank you for joining us for the first episode of the Podcast Aquatic, the official podcast of the Tennessee Aquarium. Since this is Shark Week, we thought this would be an excellent opportunity for us to talk about sharks. And for today's episode, I brought in a trio of heavy hitters, people who all have experience working with sharks. Why don't you all introduce yourselves? I can't remember everybody's title.
Kyle McPheeters, I'm a senior aquarist.
I'm Adam Johnson. I'm our animal care facility lead.
Thom Demas, I'm Vice President of Husbandry and Exhibits.
And I guess I should go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Casey Phillips. I'm the communications specialist of the Aquarium and your host of the Podcast Aquatic. Since we're talking about sharks, I think we should talk about sharks' reputation. So to a lot of people, sharks are defined by the things that they've seen in pop culture. So TV, movies, video games, and a lot of that representation is not accurate. They're one of those groups of animals, along with, I think, snakes and spiders, that people just sort of have an inherent fear of that's almost at like a primal level. But that's not true with any of you. We're all shark friends. Is that right?
Affirmative.
Yeah, I love sharks, but that doesn't mean I'm never afraid. But yeah, I love sharks.
So a healthy fear.
Healthy fear, respect, not fear.
That's good. Good distinction.
I think they've got a reputation they don't deserve. We go in the ocean, but nobody would strip down to their running shoes and running gear and take a nice long run across an African savanna and expect a lion not to mess with them. So, it's really no different than that. And yet the lion is revered as king of the jungle. So it really is a reputation, I think, that's unwarranted of the shark.
How about you, Adam?
Yeah, number one shark supporter over here, but I think they do get a little mischaracterized. I think that's a good point about the lion. I think it's easier to look at a mammal and more easily anthropomorphize it probably, but a shark we're out of our element, we're already in the water, so we're slightly uncomfortable. And then we're looking at an animal that's baring its teeth constantly, that has an eye that doesn't blink, that's often black or gray and just staring directly at us. So I think it's easier to see that as a more predatory animal, and that puts, like you were saying, a more inherent fear in us.
So how many of you have actually been in the water with sharks? I'm assuming everybody probably but me.
I guess you can't see us raise our
no
hands.
no one can see the raised hands, but Tom raised his hand.
Yeah, all three of us.
We all have.
So in what context were you all in the water with sharks just at the aquarium, or have you been in the water with sharks in the wild?
Both.
Yeah, I've been recreationally diving with them and working with them in scientific capacity in the wild, and then also here at the aquarium.
What about you, Kyle?
Yeah, so I've been diving in the wild and run into them. And just like ours here at the aquarium, when you're in the water with them, they're kind of like put off. They don't really want to come closer and come get a better look because we're loud and clumsy and noisy, and they kind of don't like that. So when you see them in the wild, at least in my experience, it's been from afar, and they may cruise by and get a closer look, and they're like, oh, that's nothing I want to hang out with, and go on their way.
What about you, Tom?
Yeah, I agree with Kyle's assessment. The only exception to that would be nurse sharks. And they tend to be really lazy and lay around and hide under rocks. And divers notoriously like to feed the nurse shark or pet the nurse shark. And if you are into shark attacks and you take the time to look this up, the one shark you really don't want to mess with is a nurse shark, because they're really inclined. If you irritate them and they do bite you, they tend not to let go. But usually, if they don't feel backed into a corner and you're messing with them, they'll just swim away. And best thing is see them from afar most of the time, but when you are up close with them, don't pester them.
As I tell my kids with all wildlife, when we're out in the woods and walking around doing whatnot, you look with your eyes, not with your hands.
Yeah, that's right.
So good rule of thumb when it comes to snakes and also with sharks. So were any of you ever afraid of sharks? The whole purpose of this podcast is to kind of talk about the fear that sort of suffuses a lot of how we perceive sharks. But as a child or even as an adult, were any of you ever afraid of sharks?
So yeah, I grew up watching Jaws. I don't know if it was reruns or it was current movies then, but I remember being a little kid and it being like the scariest thing you've ever seen. This colossal shark is eating the whole boat, like everything's just going crazy. And you go in the ocean at the beach as a kid and you're like, I can't see under the water. What if he's here? And so yeah, it's super scary. And then you put on a mask and you can see everything, and sharks aren't just going to come out and grab you. But no, as a little kid seeing those movies, and I think that's why they were so popular, just scared everybody for sure.
For me, I did have that like initial reaction to Jaws. I remember distinctly, like even being in a swimming pool and being like, "Oh, it's night. Is a shark in here?" But
I had the same fear.
Literally, it's so dumb, but
It's not dumb, bro.
But I think I was also more enveloped in the age of Shark Week when it was very educational and focused on shark conservation. So
Before it was about Michael Phelps racing a great white.
Precisely, or finding megalodon. But I think that I was always more into just seeing them in general. And I loved just being in the ocean and snorkeling around and seeing if I could find any. Like they were always my number one thing to see growing up.
Thom, were you ever afraid of sharks?
Oh, terrified. And still, honestly, I don't know if it's the sharks I've ever been afraid of. I think we have a tendency to have fear of the unknown. And to reference what Kyle said, when you can't see below the water, you don't know. And I'm 59 years old, and I can get out there, and if it's murky and an overcast day and I don't have a mask and I can't see below the water, I can still get myself spooked. It isn't because there's sharks down there. It's because you don't know what's down there. And we tend to assign that fear to the sharks, which I don't personally believe is warranted.
Yeah. So I made the mistake on the drive to go to a beach when I was probably 7. I don't know why my mom thought this was a good idea, but I was at a bookstore and bought a book that was stories of people's shark attack experiences, and I read it
read that on the way home.
Read it cover to cover in the van on the way to the beach, and then I think for the solid week I flat refused to get in the ocean, and that was probably the genesis of my fear of sharks. I don't think I saw Jaws until later. And by the way, Kyle, there's no way that you watched that when it was new, because as we'll talk about later, Jaws is actually going to turn 50 next year. So,
I didn't actually know when it came out.
Yeah, it was 1975, which is kind of a mind-blowing milestone that we're about to reach for that movie. So for 50 years, people have been afraid of sharks. And again, in my case, it was really just reading the wrong book at the wrong time, or the right book at the wrong time. I don't know. But I would like to know, so everyone here has at least experienced some degree of fear of sharks. So we're not wagging our fingers at people saying, shame on you for being afraid of sharks. So how do you graduate, or what advice would you give to people who are listening who are maybe still hold on to that fear of sharks? And how do you graduate from fear to, as Thom put it earlier, respect?
I think, again, like the Jaws, seeing how big and powerful, this is a fictional shark, of course, but it's based off real sharks. So they're so big and strong and smart, and I mean, they're a top predator in the ocean. So people might come, to see our sharks with that fear, and then they see them just like cruising by these little fish and not attacking them. They're not just like mindless killing all the other fish. And so I think that, to me, just being able to see a real shark instead of all this sensationalism, being able to see sharks just cruising around doing their thing and not just killing everything they can find.
So if you can't afford to go and put on a wetsuit and dive in the Bahamas or the Gulf of Mexico, you can come someplace like here.
Definitely. Yeah. So exhibiting these big sharks, it's really important to gain that respect from a lot of people. Just seeing the media versions of it, it skews it in a lot of people's minds. I mean, like I said, it did for me when I was a kid. Then seeing the real shark, and he's not any of those things. So that changes to me from fear to respect, and that you realize like, oh, it's not this crazy shark just wrecking everything. He's just got his place in the food chain. He's just trying to live in the ocean.
Adam, do you have any suggestions to add on to what Kyle was saying about how people can sort of transform that fear of sharks into more of a respect?
Yeah, I think
or even a love, really, actually.
Yeah, I think in addition to seeing them consuming media that portrays them for what they are is really helpful. Like there's a lot of educational documentaries. There's a lot of really good books that are easy to read and consume that explain how threatened sharks are and how important they are to the success of the ecosystems they inhabit. And for me, I think putting an animal into its ecological role and seeing how much of a difference it would be not having that animal there really adds respect for me. So yeah, I'd suggest that.
Thom?
Yeah, I just echo what they said. It basically education. Learn about what it is you're afraid of. If it's the shark, learn about the shark. And again, you'd be crazy to rub yourself down in fish chum and go swimming at dawn or dusk. You're begging for trouble. But when you understand that's when they tend to feed, is when The light is kind of twilight, and they tend to come in where the small fish are. When you begin to understand those things, then it's easier to avoid situations where there could be a problem. And that doesn't mean there's never something that pops up that's uncharacteristic. But I think understanding how they operate and what they do and why they do it, their natural history, like Adam was talking about, it'll give you a different perspective. And all of a sudden, it's not so much an unknown. And I still hold to the theory that I think most of us are afraid of the unknown.
So here at the aquarium, we have a lot of different species of sharks. So people who come here can see sharks of all sizes. Kyle is the one who I think probably at this table is currently responsible for every shark species we've got. Is that right? Are you caring for everyone?
Yeah, exactly. People might not realize this. The bulk of our quantity of species and quantity of sharks are in Stingray Bay.
That's our largest touch tank in the Ocean Journey building.
I say people might not believe that because the big sharks are so obvious and prevalent, but there's only 5 of those. In Stingray Bay, there are 7 different species, but they are all nocturnal. So people might have been here, 10 times over the course of a year as a member and have never seen one. So we do have, tiny coral cat sharks, 18 inches long, all the way up to the sand tigers. The biggest one now is almost 300 pounds.
Wow. The coral cats are probably my favorite. They were the ones that when I started working here, I'd never heard of before. And they're just, if your impression of sharks is the shark from Jaws, or just great whites, I guess, in general, a uniform, gray, sleek, torpedo-shaped fish, come and look at, or I guess do a Google search for a coral cat shark, because boy, they're really just stunningly pretty.
Very diverse group of animals. So from the little tiny coral cat shark up to the great white shark or the whale shark even. Just extremely diverse, all different, niches in the food chain, all different ways to make their living, essentially.
Yeah, and if you want the opposite effect, look up a goblin shark or a Greenland shark, because those are both terrifying. They just look strange. And so, Adam, before you went out to work at the animal care facility, which is an offsite facility where a lot of our animals who are not on exhibit are seen to, did you work with the sharks here?
I've had some minimal experience just like covering and stuff, but most of my actual experience was in college and my undergrad.
Yeah, talk about the work you did in college, because you'd mentioned that before we started, and I don't think I know this story of your experience working with sharks in that capacity.
Yeah, so I went to Jacksonville University in Florida, and my freshman year we started a partnership with OSearch, which is a huge shark tagging organization, and they do focus mostly on white sharks, but they kind of sponsored a lot of our personal undergrad research. So we were mostly looking at different shark species movements around the Jacksonville area and how they were using estuaries or if they were migrating past the beaches. And then also looking at great white shark migration population studies and stuff like that too.
So do great white sharks migrate down to Florida?
Yeah, so there's actually a resident population kind of off the coast of Jacksonville. And then a lot of them will move up towards Cape Cod, usually in the winter or late fall.
So since they're the species that is probably the most demonized by pop culture, people probably have the most heart palpitations thinking about being in the water with great whites. Have you ever been in the water with a great white?
Yeah, I saw them in South Africa. I did a study abroad there. So we were out on the boat and just saw them from the surface. I wasn't able to cage dive with them or anything, but they're huge and they're majestic and incredible to see in person.
What was that moment like for you the first time you saw an actual great white? Because there are no great whites in aquariums anywhere in the world. I think there have been attempts to have them. They don't last very long. But to see one in the wild, what was that like?
That was probably one of the most awe-inspiring animals I've ever seen. I think that was a really grounding moment of, wow, these animals are incredibly large and incredibly powerful, but incredibly beautiful also. Yeah, and just reminded me why I was so passionate about working with them in the first place.
When I think of the great white, or really just sharks in general, Thom was talking about kind of understanding their purpose and the way that they move through the water and act. Everything about their form seems like it was it's almost like there was nothing wasted in the design of a shark. They are just absolutely perfectly designed to do what they do.
You think of fish, and fish have scales, and sharks have their scales, which are called dermal denticles.
One of my favorite science words.
Yeah, just dermal denticles, basically skin teeth. Not only does that help their skin be incredibly tough, but it helps them cut through the water. The shape of those scales has shown in some cases to be antibacterial. I don't know that we know, and Adam may have more information, I don't know that we know everything that their morphology accomplishes for them. Obviously, different species have different things. The goblin shark you mentioned with the proboscis, and I don't know that we fully understand everything that their morphology does for them. But I think your comment, Casey, about how everything has a purpose and no centimeter is wasted. I think that's a really spot on description of what shark morphology or shark anatomy looks like.
Do you all have a favorite species of shark? I preempted you with a few bits of homework before this discussion, but I didn't actually ask you whether you had a favorite or not, or to think of it. I like the mako.
You like the which?
I like the mako.
The mako.
They're incredibly fast sharks,
Yeah.
and that's one of the. I just love that they look almost like a sports car. Like if a shark were a sports car, it would be a mako.
I haven't been working with the animals in a while, so forgive me if the name is wrong. But is it the lantern shark?
Mm-hmm.
It's about 4 to 6 inches, fully grown. I think southern Caribbean area, South America. I think they're found on the north. I guess it would be the northwestern banks of South America, and they're deep water dwelling. And am I not mistaken, Adam? Am I that they actually are bioluminate?
Yeah.
Which is why they're called the lantern shark. But their max size is some tiny size, like around 6 inches. Never seen one. I'm fascinated by them, and I think they're my favorite probably because I never will see one.
Well, they've got that cool trick that they do.
And there's pictures, but we need a lantern shark exhibit, fellas.
Well, this is why aquariums exist, because pictures aren't enough and videos
That's right.
aren't enough. You have to see them. There's something about seeing an animal in person that's just a different kind of experience.
I guess if I had to pick, that's so hard.
Well, you have to. It's podcast rules.
Yeah, I guess I would probably say a thresher shark. Similarly, I've never seen one, but they use their like super elongated tail as a whip to stun fish, which sounds made up. But it's incredible to watch videos of if you ever can look them up. I'd love to see one though in person. They just look prehistoric. They're so cool.
That was almost the one I was going to choose because I do love that long
They're
tail.
very cool.
I didn't know that's why they use their or how they use their tail. Kyle.
Tom talking about tiny sharks that are amazing. This wasn't and isn't my favorite, but just reminded me of the cookie cutter shark, if y'all are familiar with that.
I've never heard of this one.
Again, another tiny shark that generally stays down deep because other big things will want to eat it, so it hides out in the dark. And then it darts up and takes bites out of bigger animals. So whether it's a whale or a bigger shark or a seal, tuna, they'll catch tuna with these like plugs taken out of them from the cookie cutter shark. So they don't kill their victims. They just take a little bite and it goes off and heals, and they can bite it again later if it comes back by.
A whole new meaning to shark conservation. A very conservative shark. He can prey on the same animal over and over.
Forever.
That's smart.
One of my favorite things about the exchange that we just had is that there are probably people who only think of, again, I feel like a lot of people's perception of sharks really is limited to just great whites. And just the last 45 seconds or a minute and a half, however long we were talking, we talked about sharks that were 4 to 6 inches long. I have no idea how long a thresher is, but they're one of the larger sharks. And makos are a fairly decently sized shark as well. And the cookie cutter shark also sounds pretty small. So to say that you're afraid of something, just to say the blanket statement, I'm afraid of sharks, I feel like people don't really understand what they're saying, because I feel like they don't know enough about the diversity that exists to be able to say that with any sort of authority.
Yeah, you're not saying I'm afraid of a species. You're saying I'm afraid of this whole family of different animals, some of which would fit on a hot dog bun. I mean, come on. Why would you be afraid of that?
It's hard to be, it's like saying you're afraid of dogs because you had a bad experience with, say, a Mastiff. And then you see a Chihuahua. I mean, it's a different experience.
Different animal. Yep.
Chihuahua is definitely more scary.
I would tend to agree, actually. Let's talk about biting, because people are afraid of being bitten by sharks. But we've already, I think, established that sharks, when they bite or when they attack, that's kind of a mischaracterization of what's actually happening. So someone who's got more experience at this table than me, because I don't know anything about anything, I'm just the host, explain what's actually happening usually when a shark bites someone? What's going on?
Well, I think in general, a lot of times people tend to classify it as mistaken identity. I think that can be a little bit of a misnomer too. I think we have to understand sharks explore the world with their mouth. They have no hands. They have nothing else to use. So if a shark is hunting or is looking for prey, that's how they would sample their prey to see if that's something that they want to go after. They're usually very cautious. So a lot of times you'll notice a shark in the area and it might be looking to decide what you are, but 1 out of a million times it's going to make a move on you. But I think most of the time it is more of an exploratory action and it's not actually necessarily attempted predation all of the time. And I think it's easy to automatically assume that this shark is going to come back and continue the attack when that's a lot of times not what happens.
The problem, with Adam's point there, is that if it's a large shark and it checks you out and decides it doesn't like you, the damage is already done. So, I agree with everything you just said. I don't know that when these things happen, it really is an intention to get the person who gets bitten. It's probably more likely that it's an intent to see what it is.
It's almost like asking a question like, is this food?
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Tom had brought up that dusk and dawn. So especially low light conditions, or it's murky, or for whatever reason, the shark doesn't have a great visual on it. He just knows there's an animal in the water. So, well, let me check this out. Is this a big fish? Is this a seal? And we're not great prey at them. We have a high like bone to meat ratio compared to like a seal that's, got all that thick blubber that they want to eat.
Now I feel attacked.
You got a real high meat to bone ratio. So as soon as they get that exploratory bite, they're like, oh, what? I don't want to eat that thing, and take off. But problem's already there.
So let's go back to the origins of people's thoughts about being attacked by a shark, meaning that a shark was out to eat you. Let's go back to pop culture. So as I mentioned earlier, next year is the 50th anniversary of Jaws. And while we've established through this conversation, I think, that sharks are misportrayed in pop culture, the fact remains that it's a lucrative business for Hollywood to portray them thusly because Jaws set such a high watermark in terms of its success, and so many people tried to copy it that it sort of pigeonholed sharks into an image that they have not been able to escape from. And I looked this up earlier because I was just curious and I love statistics, but in all, the Jaws and its 3 sequels grossed $805 million globally. The Meg and the Meg 2, that's the Jason Statham shark movies that have come out more recently, collectively have grossed $926 million. Now, I didn't adjust any of this for inflation. I didn't have that kind of time. But we're already over almost to $2 billion. There are shark video games. There's a video game called Maneater, which came out a few years ago, that has you play as a shark, so turning the tables a little bit. And that sold 14 million copies. So there's very little incentive, I think, for Hollywood to portray sharks as anything other than man-eaters. I mean, do you guys agree with that? I mean, why would they want to change the way that they're portraying them if apparently the public is eating up that perception?
Yeah, I mean, just think about scary movies. I mean, whether it's about a shark or about someone breaking into your house, either way, it's scary, and so we want to go and see this, this scary story and just get immersed in it. So doing a movie showing how real sharks are. I mean, obviously we have stuff like that. Our IMAX films, there's a lot of really good content showing how sharks are in nature, and it doesn't gross $800 million. It's really amazing stuff for people that are interested and care about it. But a shark just eating everybody is going to sell a lot more than a shark doing what it really does.
So fear sells.
Absolutely.
Do you guys have a favorite example of sharks in pop culture? So even if it's completely unrealistic, and I think basically everything that's not a documentary probably is going to be fairly unrealistic, do you have a favorite example of how sharks have been portrayed, even if it's inaccurate in pop culture?
I'm going to give a shout out to Jaws, first of all, because while it did set a bad precedent, I think, for all of Hollywood, that is an incredible movie, 10 out of 10.
Amazing soundtrack, too.
Yes. Yeah, John Williams can do no wrong. But I think I'm a big horror movie fan, and so I love the movie Open Water. I think that it's more on the realistic side because the sharks take so long to figure out that they even want to eat the people. But it really sets you with the dread of like, what if you're out there in the middle of the ocean with sharks? So yeah, I think that's fun.
Is this the one about the scuba divers who are left behind?
Yeah, they get left behind on the dive boat and float out for like 3 days. And it's loosely based on a real story, which is more horrifying.
Ooh, that's nightmare fuel.
Yeah.
And Jaws, technically, I guess you could say, was based on, sort of loosely based on actual happenings.
I just want to, based on this conversation and the thing Kyle said last, I kind of want to sum up the difference between an educational movie and a Hollywood movie. And it's that sharks just want to eat and humans just want to be entertained. We're not going to stop Hollywood. We want that. Truth is, that isn't how it is. Sorry to get real on everybody there. Go ahead, Kyle.
That was deep.
That's another great movie, but it's not really about sharks. The Deep. Anyway.
I was trying to think about stuff earlier when you mentioned this, and all I could think about, and I'm going to do it, was sharks with frickin' laser beams on their heads.
Oh, yeah.
It's an Austin Powers reference.
Austin Powers, yeah.
Exactly. Dr. Evil, when you were frozen, sharks were put on the endangered species list. We weren't able to get them. Loved it.
That is a good example.
There's, I think it was Peter Benchley also, Blue Water, White Death. Mm-hmm. That's, in fact, our shark cage was in that movie.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Kyle and I talked about this a couple days ago, and neither of us have had a chance to see it. And I looked online to see if it was available to stream anywhere, just to prep for this conversation, and could not find it. So, who else? Have either of you seen it, Adam or Tom?
I have not.
I haven't either.
Oh, no. All right. Well, that movie, if you're not familiar with it, I've looked up enough to understand why it's held in such high regard. So it came out in 1971, which is 4 years before Jaws. So for a lot of people, well, not a lot of people, not compared to Jaws, for the population of people who saw it, it was probably their first opportunity to see these sharks in their natural environment. So this, one of the neat precedents that it set was the filmmakers managed to capture the first ever underwater footage of great whites. So they had that kind of visceral experience that I think you were talking about, Adam, where if you've never seen a great white before, and obviously we're kind of inundated with it in modern times, and I say that like 50 years ago is ancient history, but 50 years ago that they weren't as well represented in pop culture as they are in the post-Jaws era. So for a lot of people, it probably was that kind of visceral experience of, oh my gosh, look at how huge that animal is. But they weren't portrayed in such a way, in an exaggerated way like I think Jaws was. So that I'd be interested to know what an uncolored reception would be like to that movie and seeing a great white without Jaws sitting there in the background and kind of coloring what you were seeing on screen.
I think most people, if you pick an animal they don't have a certain feeling about, our first thing isn't to be afraid. It's to be excited and interested. I expect that's how people felt when they saw that.
Yeah, the closest I think that we get to that at the aquarium is just seeing how kids react. When they come into the aquarium and they go through the Ocean Journey building and they see the Secret Reef, which if you've not been here before, that's our largest exhibit. It's 618,000 gallons, which is huge. It's the footprint of an NBA basketball court, but it's 33 feet deep. And to watch little kids run up to that acrylic window, the first one that you see your first glimpse of the exhibit, and see how they react when they see a shark swim by, one of the sand tigers or the sandbars that Kyle mentioned earlier, that their pure excitement is really kind of heartwarming to see, because you see what how the rest of us would probably perceive these animals if we didn't have this misportrayal sort of looming in the background.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I think on that note, it's really cool to read literary descriptions of sharks prior to 1974 when the book Jaws came out. I was actually looking up some about the 1916 attacks that inspired Jaws, and it is kind of actually funny. It's almost the complete opposite view of sharks. People thought that the initial attacks were sea turtles because they were so determined that it couldn't be a shark, because the public perception of them was just a larger fish, which I think is so interesting that they weren't even on their radar at that point.
That's fascinating. Where did you see that?
There's a few news articles about like the initial attack, and someone described seeing a shark, and there were like 12 quotes about how it couldn't have been. It was like in a newspaper from the Jersey Shore at that point.
I was about to say, so this was up in, it was New Jersey, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so, and that was found to be, or they think it was a bull shark, is that right?
Potentially, because there were attacks pretty far up the river near the beach, but yeah, thinking it could have been a bull shark.
So as we look back at pop culture depictions of sharks that have made them the villain, is there any benefit whatsoever to actual sharks out in the wild of having this kind of representation on screen? Or is it 100% just a hatchet job? Is it a bad thing?
I don't know. I think if it's paired with an understanding of their ecological role, could be good. Like, I think it's healthy to have a respect of them. They are a powerful predatory animal, some sharks. But I think for the most part, if your average person is only consuming fearful media, I think it takes away from the importance and the role that sharks play in our environment. And I think it allows people to be a lot more okay with harmful acts on sharks, like shark culling events or legislation that could hurt sharks potentially just because of like poor fishing regulations or things like that. So I think the more you understand them, you can pair that with a fun, like sharks can be spooky and can be a good movie villain, but I think you have to be able to place that in the fiction category too.
That's a good point, because what people maybe don't realize if they've not taken the time to look beyond the movies is that sharks really have a lot more to fear from us than we do from them. Some statistics that may make you feel a little bit better about going in the ocean and being around sharks that I looked up. The Florida Museum of Natural History's International Shark Attack File, which keeps track of statistics about provoked and unprovoked attacks. So what Thom mentioned earlier about messing with a nurse shark, that would be considered a provoked attack. Or I think they categorize if you're spearfishing in the vicinity of a shark, you are inviting that kind of behavior through your behavior. So that would be considered provoked. But in an entire year, so last year, 2023, there were only 91 confirmed shark attacks. That's worldwide. And of those, only 69 were considered unprovoked. Now, that's a slight increase over what the 5-year average was before that, when it was down. I think the average was 63 between 2018 and 2022. But that's a very slight increase, and that's still, in the grand scheme of things, you have much more to fear from a lot of other things that could happen to you en route to the ocean. The car that you're driving in is far more likely to kill you than the shark that you might chance upon in the ocean. And in the U.S., between 1970 and the year 2000, there were only 12 deaths associated with shark attacks between 1970 and the year 2000. So in 30 years, only 12 people actually died from shark attacks. During the same period, looking just at people who live along the coastline, 1,500 people died from lightning strikes. So you're 100 times more likely to get struck by lightning and killed than you were to be attacked and killed by a shark. So feel better about going in the water, I guess, basically, is the conclusion to come to from those statistics.
Yeah, it's too bad for those 12 people, obviously. That was pretty impactful for them. But the millions and millions of the rest of us that went in the ocean during that time without incident. And I can't even think, I've never even met a single person that's been struck by lightning. And it's 100 times more likely to happen to somebody.
Yeah, and in fact, you're more likely even to get struck and killed by a coconut falling from a tree. I think 150 people die worldwide every year from coconuts falling from trees. So be more afraid of, I guess, palms than sharks.
And you can really take a lot of that statistics into your own hands too, just kind of understanding shark behavior. Like Thom was saying earlier, dusk and dawn are obviously prime hunting hours for larger shark species. If you know what to look for in your geographical region, great white sharks love seals, so don't go swimming with seals if you're off the coast of California. Just things like that. If you do a little bit of research about the sharks around you, you can avoid a lot of the incidents, I think, by doing that.
Yeah, it's back to education. It's, don't walk under a coconut tree without paying attention to what's happening. It's the same thing. But having said that, and going back to your other question, please, Hollywood, if you're listening, don't stop making great movies. It's on us. We are a very smart species on this planet. If we want to be entertained, if we want to have good government, if we want to have whatever it is we want, it's on us to educate ourselves and make sure we understand what's going on. I, for one, want to watch stuff that entertains me. So Hollywood, keep making great movies, and, let's keep going seeing them, support Hollywood. But you guys, we got to support sharks. We got to make sure we educate ourselves, because I have no idea how many people are attacked by large animals when they're in wild places around the world, but I bet you it's a lot more frequent than sharks.
Well, and as I mentioned earlier, sharks have a lot more to fear from us, because every year somewhere between 70 and 80 million sharks are killed in fisheries around the world. So again, 70 people are attacked, only less than one a year dies, but 80 million sharks a year die thanks to human activity in fisheries. And of those, 30% of those species that are killed in those events are threatened species. So it's easy to look at something like a great white or the mako or the bull or the tiger shark and assume that because it is that perfectly built predatory machine, it can't be harmed in the way that the animals that we tend to think of being endangered can be harmed. But they're just as susceptible as any animal is to human activity and misuse.
Absolutely.
Well, I think it's obvious from the conversation that we've had that there are an awful lot of misconceptions about what sharks are actually like out in the wild. So I'm glad we had the chance to bring the three of you on to share your own experiences with sharks so that people can go to the ocean a little better armed with knowledge, not just the villainous portrayal of sharks that they've seen on the big screen. And hopefully they can view sharks with a little bit more, if not love or admiration, then certainly respect for the important role that they play in marine ecosystems all around the world. Thanks to all three of you for taking the time to come in and join us on the Podcast Aquatic, help to launch the podcast by showing people a different, more positive side to animals that are so frequently misunderstood and have been for such a long time. And thank you for joining us for today's episode, the first episode of the Podcast Aquatic, the official podcast of the Tennessee Aquarium. If you have an idea for a future episode of the podcast or a question for an expert like Kyle or Adam or Tom, send an email to podcast@tnaqua.org. In the meantime, Tom, Adam, Kyle, thanks again.
Thank you. That was fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me.